There is a man who died 3 times and came back every single time, who survived fires, decades of darkness, and everything the world threw at him. But what if the 4th time wasn't a flame, but something far slower? Today we're exploring what would happen if William Afton, already as a decaying Springtrap, found the only place on Earth that could rival his own experiments, and discovered that getting in doesn't mean getting out. If you're into dark lore and crossovers that actually make sense, subscribe, drop a like, and comment which universe you want to see next. It was 1983, and William Afton was not the kind of man who wasted information. His office smelled of machine oil and old paper. Animatronic schematics covered the walls like a second layer of wallpaper. And on his desk, between production reports and Freddy Fazbear's pizza invoices, sat a newspaper clipping he'd torn out 3 days ago and still hadn't thrown away. Joey Drew Studios. Dozens of employees missing. Building sealed by authorities. Officials investigate reports of experiments with animated matter. Afton read it once, then read it again, slower, with the quiet attention of someone who recognizes something familiar in a stranger's face. A man had built a machine capable of binding souls to physical matter, not to metal, not through agony, but through ink. A synthetic organic material that accepted consciousness without requiring suffering as the price of entry. Afton folded the clipping into 4 parts and placed it in the bottom drawer of his desk, beneath a floor plan of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza and a notebook filled with Remnant research notes. He didn't need this. Not yet. But he never discarded what he didn't need anymore. This, he still might. He closed the drawer and went back to work. Decades passed. The fire at Fazbear's Fright had consumed more than wood and old wiring. Springtrap had escaped through the foundations, dragging the destroyed suit across wet concrete until he surfaced 3 blocks away, in the dark of an alley that appeared on no city map. He stayed there for hours that could have been days, because time worked differently when you were the only thing that refused to stop inside a body that had already decided to. The metal was grinding. Not the usual sound. Not the creak of old joints he'd learned to ignore through years inside a haunted pizzeria. This was different. Deeper. More internal. As if the suit's framework was failing not from the outside in, but from the inside out. The spring lock plates in his chest moved unevenly. His left arm responded half a second late, and the remnant was weakening. Afton understood what that meant. He had spent years studying the anchoring process, the way extreme agony fused a soul to a physical object, like resin into wood. Remnant wasn't eternal. It was stable as long as the vessel was stable. And the vessel was destroying itself from within. Spring by spring, plate by plate, in a process no amount of will could reverse. It was there, crouched in that dark alley, that he opened the drawer. Not the physical one, the one in his memory, which Afton kept organized with the same meticulous precision he applied to everything. He located the file in seconds. Newspaper clipping, 1983. Joey Drew Studios. Animated matter. Souls without agony. A technology that did what Remnant did, but by a different path. A machine that didn't need a fixed vessel, because the ink itself was the vessel. He stood up. His left arm responded late. He started walking anyway. Joey Drew Studios had been sealed by the authorities decades ago. But seals meant nothing to someone who had learned to enter places through the back. Afton forced open a ventilation grate in the basement and descended into a corridor flooded with black ink that reached the suit's knees. The lights didn't work, but the eyes inside the mask could see well enough in the dark. The place was alive in a way that wasn't exactly life. Silhouettes moved along the walls, not shadows cast by physical objects, but shapes that existed independently of any light source. Hunched figures dragging their feet through the corridor as if they no longer remembered where they were going. The lost ones. Souls of employees the ink machine had devoured and regurgitated as hollow shells, drifting without direction between the ruins of destroyed filing cabinets. Afton moved between them without stepping aside. He had seen trapped souls before. The difference was that the children inside the animatronics still had rage. These had nothing left. Joey Drew's research files were on the 3rd floor, in a room that had once been a production office before it became an archive. Afton opened folder after folder with the same clinical precision of 1983, reading carefully, ignoring the ink bleeding down the walls like sweat. The process was more elegant than Remnant.
Joey had discovered that the ink responded to the soul's intent, not its pain. A soul placed into the ink with clarity of purpose became part of the machine, willingly. You read all of this and still came. The voice came from a corner of the room. Afton was certain he'd already checked. He turned slowly. Joey Drew was sitting in an old chair, or what remained of Joey Drew, an old, hollowed man with the sunken eyes of someone who had watched his own work destroy everything around him and still couldn't look away. There was ink at the edges of his fingers, in the folds of his jacket. He looked less like a person and more like the impression a person leaves on a surface after staying in the same place for too long. You've read enough to know what the machine does, said Joey. You know what it costs. Everything costs something, Afton replied. His voice came out distorted through the suit, lower than it had been in life. I just was never the one who paid. Joey looked at him for a long moment, with the expression of someone who recognizes in a stranger's face the exact mistake they can no longer undo. That's exactly what you're about to learn here, he said, very quietly. That eventually, the bill arrives with your name on it. Afton didn't answer. He folded the last file and continued down the corridor. If you're enjoying this crossover, drop a like right now. It helps the channel keep bringing content like this. The ink machine was in the deepest basement of the studio, in a chamber the ink had claimed completely. It was larger than Afton had imagined from the records, an industrial structure that consumed the entire back wall, with pipes descending from the ceiling like inverted roots, all pulsing with black ink that had its own temperature. Afton stood before it for a moment, not in admiration, in calculation, assessing what he'd need to activate it without the soul components Joey had originally used. The floor shook, not a structural tremor, something that came from within the ink itself, a pressure that expanded from below, and made the chamber's black surface ripple like skin. And then the ink demon was there. He hadn't entered through the door. He had simply materialized at the center of the chamber, as if the surrounding ink were merely an extension of his own body. Tall, distorted, with the vaguely familiar silhouette of a cartoon that had been stretched and twisted by hands that understood nothing of proportion. No eyes that were eyes, but a presence that filled the chamber in a way that made him impossible to ignore. He hadn't detected Afton as a threat. He had detected him as an anomaly. A soul that refused to obey the cycle, that didn't dissolve into the ink like the others, that stood before the machine with the posture of someone who had come to take something and hadn't yet decided how. The ink demon advanced. The impact was physical and brutal. Ink against deteriorating metal. A formless, irrational force against a will that had survived decades inside a destroyed suit. Afton was thrown against the wall, and the left arm that already responded late simply stopped responding. The remnant trembled. The chest plates gave another 2 centimeters, and then the temperature in the chamber changed. It was subtle at first, a shift the ink detected before anything physical registered it. The puppet hadn't entered through the door either. She was simply there, at the center of the chamber, between the two of them, with the painted face and the eyes that weren't the eyes of a creature, but the eyes of a child who had decided not to forget. The ink demon stopped, not by rational choice. He had never had a soul, and so he had never felt the presence of one with the clarity he felt in that moment. Something that existed in the chamber's space without needing the ink as support, without needing a vessel, without needing anything except the refusal to leave. It was the exact opposite of what he was, and the exact opposite of what Afton needed. Afton's remnant reacted the only way it still could. It trembled.
I see you.
Not fear. Afton had decided decades ago he no longer felt fear. It was recognition. The anchoring system identifying the presence of the souls that had been corroding the remnant for years. The echoes of the 5 children Charlotte Emily had given life to, who had never stopped existing as a force of friction against what he was. He pulled back, not in panic, with the same methodical precision he had applied to everything in his life, calculating that what he had lost in that moment could be recovered, that there were other paths, that information was never wasted, and that he had survived worse than an ink chamber and a soulless demon. He was in the basement corridor when he heard the voice. It didn't come from outside the suit. It didn't come from the walls or the ink. It came from inside the space where the remnant had begun to fracture. From the crack, the fire had opened, and the ink demon had widened, and the puppet had, for a moment, crossed, without asking permission. You can't keep coming back forever. Afton stopped. He stood in the dark corridor, with ink at the suit's knees and his left arm unresponsive, and the chest plates 2 centimeters further gone than when he'd entered. He stood there for exactly 4 seconds, which was the time it took him to process an unsolvable problem and file it as pending rather than a defeat. Then he kept walking.
I always
come back, he said to no one or to everything, because the difference had stopped mattering a long time ago. The studio fell behind him.
The ink sealed the corridor like a curtain, and somewhere deep inside, in the chamber where the ink machine still pulsed with its own temperature, the puppet stayed where she was, without hurry, because she had learned decades ago that some bills arrive with the right name on them, and she could wait.